Ready for our next session. It's called The Idea of India. What is India? And how has the idea of India evolved over the years? To explore these questions and to understand the shifts in paradigms, our next session, called The Idea of India, will have political commentator Dr. Sanjaya and political scientist Sumantra Bose in conversation with the veteran journalist Monideepa Banerjie. We shall begin the session shortly.
A few minutes, in fact, maybe a minute or so, the idea of India. Dr. Sumantra Bose, Dr. Sanjaya in conversation with Monideepa Banerjie. We'll start, all our writers are here. We'll start in a couple of minutes.
We're ready to begin our session on the idea of India with Dr. Sanjaya Baru, Sumantra Bose, and Monideepa Banerjie.
Okay, I believe the introductions have already been made, but I will briefly recall and recap. Dr. Sanjaya Baru, I think most famous for The Accidental Prime Minister, the book he wrote on Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, but since then has been doing some stellar writing on the state of the Indian economy. And Dr. Sumantra Bose, who is of Kolkata and is now director of the Netaji Research Bureau, and of course a professor who has taught across the world, right? Politics and history. And it's wonderful to have them with me, Monideepa Banerjie. I am a journalist, and if I'm lucky, you will remember that I used to be with NDTV till last year, but since then I have moved on. Can you all hear me? Shunte pacchen shobai? Huh? Yeah? Yeah, all of you can hear? Ar jara pichone achen, I wish you all would come in front, because it's always nice to see who all are listening to us. But anyway, today we are talking about the idea of India at 75, but I would like to start with a question to all of you over here. How many of you have seen the film Pathan, the blockbuster of the season? Hey, that's just 2 people. I can't believe it. Can we have a show of hands? A total show of hands? What about you on the dais? No? Not yet. Okay, they haven't seen it. And how many of you remember a film called Jugnu? Not Dharmendra and Hema Malini, but Dilip Kumar and Noor Jahan. Any of you remember that? Well, I remember it, I have seen it, and that will give away my age, but Jugnu was the blockbuster of 1947. And it starred Dilip Kumar and Noor Jahan, and back then it grossed 50 lakh rupees in the year of our independence. It released in May of 1947 and made that much money, which in today's terms I believe is 350 odd crore. Of course, we know Pathan, even if you haven't seen it, you must have read, has grossed 711 crore already and counting. Now, I have brought up these films because book ended between Jugnu in 1947 and Pathan in 2023. India turned 75 years old last year. And the idea of India, which is also 75, is still growing and evolving. I mean, it's still a dynamic thing that is growing and evolving. One more question before I start asking them the question. How many of you know about the book called The Idea of India? Show of hands. 1, 2, 3. Oh, I'm so happy to see that. And how many of you know who wrote it? 1, 2, 3. Sir, I'm sure you remember who wrote it. Professor Sunil Khilnani. This was back in, oh, you do too, great, 1997. And that was the title of his book, The Idea of India. And Professor Khilnani teaches now at Ashoka University and used to teach in King's College in London. I didn't know about the book till recently. I have bought it and I'm reading it and I haven't finished it. But I'm told authoritatively that somewhere in the book there is a line that is paraphrased from Tagore. And it's a line we have all heard. That India is a state of mind. Last question. How many of you agree with that line? India is a state of mind. Well, good. There are some who agree, some who are not sure what to make of it. But let me now dive straight into the question that I would like to start with. India, a state of mind. Right, and if we go with that, I mean, we have crossed the pandemic, a huge health crisis. But if India is a state of mind, and one of you can decide who wants to answer first. If India is a state of mind, what is the state of our mental health today? Are we a country, still held together by invisible and strong threads? Or are we a country that, again paraphrasing Tagore, a country divided by narrow domestic walls of religion, political polarization, and terrible economic disparities? Dr. Baru, let's go for economic disparities first. The state of our mental health.
Well, first of all, the Constitution of India begins with the line, India, that is Bharat, is a union of states. Can you hear me? I said the Constitution of India begins with the line, India, that is Bharat, is a union of minds. Is a union of states. Each state is itself a union of several sub-cultures. And I think the point to recognize about our country is that we have remained a successful union despite all these pressures. I mean, you mentioned some of the problems that we face, whether it's religious division or economic division or caste division. There are any number of fault lines along which this society has been divided, along which contentious issues have been, dealt with. But the fact is that we have remained together. And I think it's a great achievement of the Indian mind that despite all the pressures on it, it remains a union. And I think it's important to recognize today that it is a union. I think that the attempt to suggest that it is a homogeneous entity is a false path to take. If we, in the earlier session, Rudrangshu said, and I speak Telugu, he speaks Bengali, somebody speaks Hindi, and yet we are all able to communicate with each other. And not just in the English language or not just in Hindi. I think at a very basic level, the people of this country have been able to communicate and therefore remain together in many situations of crisis, whether those crises were economic, like in 91, or health, like in the COVID, or a war. Each of these situations we have dealt with as a country, and I think that is our strength. So unity in diversity remains the foundational principle of this country.
That's terrifically optimistic and a wonderful note to begin on. Dr. Bose, would you agree with him all the way, or are you worried about the fragility of the state of the union?
Seems to be working. Akon? That's loud and clear, I think. Well, I certainly agree with Dr. Baru just said about India being a free and voluntary union rather than a top-down entity. I would just add in response to your question, Monideepa, that to me, and I suspect to a good number of others, even in the times we live in, India is a civilization first, and only then a state in the modern sense of the term. Of course, calling India a civilization first and only then a state could get us into treacherous waters too, because it opens there's a risk of opening a can of worms about what constitutes the essence of that civilization. However, I think the point still stands. I think a lot of trouble comes not just in the present, post-2014 era, but since our independence in 1947, because of state centrism. That is why, for all its risks, I prefer the civilizational framework to the state-centric framework. Because whenever there has been a fetish made of the state, its territorial integrity, its supremacy, problems have inevitably followed. And this started during Pandit Nehru's premiership, exacerbated further during his daughter's premiership, and it continues to dog us today. So I would warn against state centrism and the state-centric approach. Let us put other things first. A state is something that is inherently human-made. It cannot be the essence of anything. I think we should look for our essence elsewhere.
Okay. You will have to tell us more about where we should be looking for it. But I just want to go into, a bit of a real thing, and that is the economy. And first of all, I sort of want to ask you that post-pandemic, you have a whole book now of wonderful essays. Dr. Baru has... Where did I leave your book? I've left your book over there. Dr. Baru has brought out a book of essays on, the post-pandemic state of the economy. And in that, you speak a lot about the uncertainty that, has been thrust upon us. He sort of says that the pandemic and the impact on the economy is like the World War II's impact on Europe's economy, but just a little bit worse, because after the World War II, you said that, things started looking up. There was reconstruction and rebuilding, and there was optimism that things would get better. We can't say that in the post-pandemic situation just yet. You also talk about how the government of India, or any government struck by the pandemic, to sort of revive its economy, should unleash the animal spirit. That is also very important to bring the economy back on track. We've just had the budget. Do you think that's happening? Do you see that happening? Is the government moving in the right direction? And what kind of rate of growth can we see now after the pandemic?
Well, let me put things in a perspective. From 1950 to 1980, for 30 years, this economy grew at the rate of 3.5% per annum. From 1980 to 2000, we grew at 5.5%. From 2000 to 2015, we grew at 7.5%. So the entire story of a rising India was built on these three numbers of 3.5, 5.5, 7.5. And we expected to grow at that pace between 7 to 8%. If you see all the documents written in the last 10, 15 years, the expectation is that what economists call the potential growth rate for India is 7 to 8%. But in the last 7, 8 years, we have been very much below the potential. The average growth rate has certainly not been 7.5, it's below. In fact, in the last 3 years, thanks to COVID, it went down to an average of 3%. Now, from that perspective, I think in the last budget, Nirmala Sitharaman had this sentence, which she said that government is now going to spend more money in order to help or enthuse the private sector. That is, the phrase she used was to kick in private investment. 1 year down the road, that has not happened. We do not see any increase in private investment. As a consequence, once again in this budget, she has done the correct thing in my view of continuing to increase government spending and public investment, capital expenditure, once again in the hope that private investment will come in. We have to wait and watch. What drove the high growth of the period which I call the golden years of growth, which was really from 2003 to 2010, those 7 years when we had close to 9%. The last year of Vajpayee and the first term of Manmohan Singh, we had an average of 8.8% or so. What drove that growth was high level of private investment. There were problems as a consequence, etc. I don't want to go into that. I think what we need today is to revive, and that's the phrase, which is actually a Keynesian phrase, what are called animal spirits of private enterprise, which is the willingness of businessmen to take risk. The term animal spirits essentially refers to the willingness of an individual to take risk. And the point that I make in that book which you refer to, which is an analysis of the post-COVID economy, is that the uncertainty created by COVID, which was a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic crisis, really shook household confidence. A lot of households started saving more, spending less, partly because of the fear that they were losing jobs or young people not getting enough jobs. So a rise in unemployment, etc., middle class spending had gone down. And then comes the Russia-Ukraine war, which pushes up oil prices. So taken together, we are now in a phase where people are more cautious.
True.
As a consequence, the government is trying to inject more demand into the system, but it cannot sustain itself given the fiscal pressures. So at some point, people have to feel more confident about the future, which in my judgment, they are not yet feeling.
How do you think Netaji would have felt about the way our economy is unfolding? I know this is a completely speculative question and answer, but I do recall that back in 1938, it was Netaji who had proposed and set up the National Planning Committee and had actually requested Jawaharlal Nehru to head it. And Jawaharlal Nehru agreed to do so, and we then had what came to be called Planning Commission, and now of course it's called the Niti Aayog. How, are you, as a watcher of the Indian economy and political economy, what do you think, and what do you think Netaji may have thought of the state of the economy?
Well, I can't get into Netaji's mind at this moment,
True.
but you're absolutely right that he had very clear-cut ideas about the economic reconstruction of India from 200 years of the ravages of colonial rule and exploitation. So in November 1938, during his first term as the president of the Indian National Congress, he established the National Planning Committee, or NPC. Gandhiji was not, very pleased with the initiative because his worldview was different. And Bose's worldview was, state-led industrialization. That should be the pivot of the strategy, and harnessing the potential of modern science and technology from across the world. So a very modernist, and for its times, a very, conventionally progressive view of how India should be economically run and reconstructed. And he actually invited Pandit Nehru to take the chairmanship of this committee, and he wrote a letter to Pandit Nehru saying that I hope you will agree, you must, if it is to be a success, if this idea is to be a success. Pandit Nehru gladly accepted. And there's a famous photograph of Bose giving the opening address to a gathering of the most eminent experts, scientists and economists of the time, while Pandit Nehru sits, diligently taking notes. So, Netaji was very much a person of his times, and at that time, a forward-looking leader would almost naturally believe in the virtues of state-led industrialization, a planned economy, and so on. However, we are talking 1938 is 85 years ago, and I think a test of leadership is for views to evolve over time.
True.
Because times change, circumstances change, the nation's needs and imperatives also change. So I would like to believe that Netaji would have moved with the times and not been rigid or dogmatic, as so many have been, on both sides. Yeah, we've had dogmatic Marxists, refusing to budge an inch, and on the other side, we've had free market capitalists clinging to their own dogmas and shibboleths. So I would like to believe that Netaji would have evolved and would have not been a prisoner of rigidity and dogma.
I hope we can say the same about our current leaders 80 years from now. I'm going to ask a couple of quick questions for quick answers. One is that you mentioned that 2003 to 2015 was one of the decades of the highest growth. But just yesterday or the day before, the Prime Minister in Parliament called those 10 years of the UPA, almost all of it, a lost decade. Could I have a quick reaction to what you make of that statement?
That's factually incorrect. First of all, the golden years of growth were 2003 to 2010, 7 years. I call them the golden years in my latest book on the Indian economy because you had almost close to 9% growth, 8.8. So really high rates of growth. And the consequence of that was the sharpest decline in poverty, a sharp increase in employment, a rise in foreign exchange reserves, increase in India's share of world trade. All indicators showed an improvement during those 7 years. The problem begins after the, partly because of the financial crisis of 2009. The impact was with a delay. India started feeling that, and then of course we had our own problems at home with Pranab Mukherjee becoming finance minister, brought in retrospective taxation. Unfortunately, I'm speaking in Kolkata, but I think Mr. Mukherjee, the economy paid a big price for his being finance minister. And the slowdown began, and a lot of problems began. So the Prime Minister Modi's statement that it was a lost decade was factually incorrect. I think the real problem is that between 2012 and 2018, we see a deceleration of growth. Growth is slowing down. But still we are around 6, 1 year 7%, 1 year 6%, which is not too bad. Then comes the pandemic.
Correct.
And we have not recovered.
Absolutely not.
And nothing that has been done in the last 3 years has helped us go back. We are still, whatever the official numbers may be, the average growth rate has been 3%. So, unless we see a dramatic improvement in the next 2 years, or not even 2 years, 1 more year before the next election, I think the overall decadal record of Prime Minister Modi, the average, would work out to be, in my judgment, not more than about 5 to 6%, as compared to the overall decadal average of Manmohan Singh, which, despite the slowdown, is 7.5%.
Okay. Now, are we going to see a dramatic change? Let me ask you, because, he is a specialist in everything economy. I don't know if you are. I'm not. And I'm not sure how many people out in the audience are, keeping a very close eye on the state of the economy, as perhaps Dr. Baru would like us to. But what I'm sure everybody is aware of today, because it's been unfolding in the last few days, is the Hindenburg report. Once something like that comes out, as an ordinary lay person who, I don't know if you have investments in the market, but as an ordinary person, do you feel we are going to, make a dramatic economic comeback, or will there be a price to pay for things like, the whole controversy over Mr. Gautam Adani's stocks and shares?
I think the specialist in economics should go first.
No. I don't want the specialist view. I want the layman's view, because I want to know what you think.
Okay, well, I'm a professor of politics and not economics. But of course, I've been talking to various people about this particular issue. Friends of mine who are, involved with the world of finance capital in various ways have told me that well, one has to be a little cautious of these short sellers because they have their own
Dynamics,
motives,
yes.
and also the timing of the report and so on. However, there also appears to be a consensus that the remarkable meltdown of the Adani stocks shows, cannot be caused simply by a malicious report, and that there is something there which has, genuinely spooked investors. The people who know more about this particular area than I do have told me that yes, quote-unquote malicious, report could lead to a sharp fall for a day or two, but after that there would be a significant recovery. But that does not seem to be the case. And also, as I see it, the Prime Minister, from his rather defensive performance in Parliament, particularly this week, seems to have been personally rattled by this episode. So, of course, one wants to believe the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India that there will not be any contagion, that there will not be any knock-on effects for the economy at large. I'm sure we all certainly hope so, but I think, common sense tells us that there could be contagion to some extent, and it's quite a significant meltdown, and this nexus of the government and this particular business group does seem to be something that could cause us broader economic headaches.
The expert.
Can I come in on this? Because
Yes, please, of course.
I
You're
have
the
a
expert.
personal, no, not because I'm an expert, but I have a personal stake, which is to sell one of my recent books called
Yes.
India's Power Elite, Caste, Class and Cultural Revolution, which was published by Penguin last year. And I have a whole chapter in that book on the nexus between business and politics. And I go into some detail on the historical evolution of this nexus, what we call crony capitalism. I think I entirely agree with what Dr. Bose said, and I'm not going to repeat what he has said. But let me make in addition 2 points. Point number 1 is that in the past, when businessmen were very close to politicians, they were never in your face. Ambani's, for example, were very, very close to Mrs. Gandhi, but it was not in your face. Also, the media was, more traditional media. Now we have social media. I think Mr. Adani's friendship, Mr. Modi, has become in your face, right? All those photographs of him in the plane. So there is a public perception of cronyism, which is stronger. I remember the exchange between J.R.D. Tata and G.D. Birla when J.R.D. Tata launched the Swatantra Party and said that this is the political party for business. And G.D. Birla told him, you're wasting your time. Let us stick to the Congress. It's a better party for business than Swatantra.
Okay.
And he proved right? So this nexus is there. But right now, the Adani-Modi nexus is there in your face. And therefore, I think a lot of the perceptions have been created by the fact that people see this nexus. And also Gujarati, all those factors work in India. Ambani's were Gujarati, but Indira Gandhi was not. The second factor, which I think is an important factor, is that all the popular businessmen, whether it's Tata Group, Ambani's, Bajaj, Birlas, all of them have large numbers of shareholders across the country, and therefore have won the trust of the market over several years.
Correct.
Dhirubhai Ambani's entire strategy was to create a middle-class shareholding, right? He had shareholders meetings in auditoriums and cricket stadiums, right? Mr. Adani's strategy has been to limit his shareholding to a few institutional investors and to all kinds of anonymous sources. He has no shareholder base. So the middle class says, well, I know Ambani's, they have benefited me. I know the Birlas, they benefited me. Bajaj, Hamara Bajaj, right? But Adani, I have no association with him because there is no sari that I buy from an Adani company, no scooter that I buy from an Adani company,
true.
no refrigerator, no product in a
Yeah.
middle class family.
True.
He is building roads and making power projects,
And
and
airports.
everybody knows that these are all ways of making money. Politicians have both their hands into every road, every power project, every infrastructure project. Every political party has all their fingers in it.
You have just undone all the optimism you started with. Like, I'm very worried about, the idea of India, after what you just said. Shuzazi, how are we doing for time? I have come away without a watch. We are good? Because I want to come to the other aspect of, the idea of India, which wasn't there back in 1975 in written words, but it was certainly there, I believe, in spirit. And that is the idea of secularism. Is it taking a beating? And, I'm sorry I don't have Dr. Baru's book, but Dr. Bose has this very interesting book that I chanced upon, 2018 book on a comparison between religion and secularism in India and Turkey. And I think we would do well to remember that the people in Turkey today are a devastated lot. I think the death toll in the earthquake has gone up to some 15,000 or so, and the horror stories coming out of there are just completely heartbreaking, and we should remember them even at an occasion like this, I believe. But the book is a different story, and the whole idea of secularism in India and Turkey, a very, very interesting way of looking at secularism. And in the book, I understand there is mention of a 1928 committee set up by the Congress, 1928 committee set up by the Congress, Motilal Nehru chairing it, Netaji a member of it, a committee to look into the tenet or the position that secularism would have in the India of the future. What was it all about? Can you tell us a little about it?
Right. So in 1928, the annual session of the Indian National Congress was held here in Calcutta at the Park Circus Maidan, and Subhash Chandra Bose was its main organizer. The president of the Congress that year was Pandit Motilal Nehru, and a high-level committee was set up to formulate the fundamental principles of the Constitution of Free India. The fundamental principles of the Constitution of Free India. This is 1928. As Congress President, Motilal Nehru chaired this committee of 8 members, and Subhash Chandra Bose was one of the members of the committee. One of the recommendations, findings or injunctions, however you call it, perhaps injunctions is the best word, was that the future, free Republic of India shall have no state religion and will not, moreover, directly or indirectly endow any religion, give any religion any preferential status over any other, and so on and so forth. And this commitment was reiterated 3 years later during the Karachi session of the Indian National Congress, which was held during the civil disobedience movement and a lot of British repression, that the future free India would be neutral on between religions. So it is actually a completely false claim that the Indian notion of quote-unquote secularism is inspired by the West or seeks to be imitative of the West. It is indigenously rooted, and it is indigenously rooted above all in the ethic of tolerance, equality, and coexistence, which has been part of our Indian tradition for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. The everyday ethic of tolerance, mutual respect, equality of communities, and coexistence. This is also a pragmatic necessity. because in a very diverse country and a multi-religious society like ours, without this ethic being upheld by the state, being enshrined constitutionally, you cannot have a functioning state or a functioning society. So this ethic of tolerance, mutual respect, equality and coexistence is a pragmatic necessity. It is also deeply embedded in the Indian tradition. That is where the Indian notion of secularism comes from, not from any Western source. And if you look at the three top figures of the Indian independence movement, Gandhi, Nehru and Bose, yes, they were somewhat different personalities, each of them. Yes, they had their differences. For example, Nehru and Bose were very much on the same page when it came to their modernist view of economics. Gandhiji was not. He had a different worldview and he was entitled to that. But despite their differences, Gandhi, Nehru, Bose were part of the same camp. You know, they converged on upholding this ethic of tolerance, mutual respect, equality as non-negotiable, and coexistence of all Indians, not just as a pragmatic necessity, but as also something that is deeply part of our tradition. Now, nowadays, because you use the S word, secularism, it's almost, gone out of vogue. Certainly politicians, but even scholars, my tribe of people, they rarely use the word, secularism. I am a proud secularist. There are, in my book, I say that there are flaws and faults in what I call the really existing secular state, the really existing Indian secular state that came into being after 1947, okay? This is taken from really existing secularism, socialism, of course, as opposed to idealized socialism or, the vision versus the reality. Yes, there are many things to be criticized in the post-1947 really existing Indian secular state, but the ethic is something that is most valuable and that is absolutely indispensable for our functioning and our future as a nation. It must be rescued.
Dr. Baru, in your time at the Prime Minister's office, what did you see that put secularism as center stage in policy making? Was that there was secularism something that was considered at making of every policy, or what? I just remember one thing, and I may be wrong in the dates, but the Sachar committee was set up by Dr. Singh, and the report came out in the tenure of Dr. Singh. And for those who may not recall, the Sachar committee was asked to look into the condition of the minority Muslim community in India and other minority communities. Didn't present a very happy picture when the report was finally submitted. So, Dr. Banerjie, did you see anything in your time at the Prime Minister's office that sort of underscored the fact that secularism was indeed at the heart of Indian polity?
Let me say two things. First and foremost, we have to recognize that as a nation, we are an ancient civilization, but we are a new nation. We came into being in 1947, 75 years. Many other countries that came into being around that time have had their problems. Yugoslavia doesn't even exist. North and South Korea remain divided. So if you look at the world, the countries that came into being at the end of the Second World War have had different trajectories. So I think apart from the ideology of secularism, there is a very real reason why the Indian state believed in secularism as a unifying principle of the Indian state. I used to be a member of the National Security Advisory Board when Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee was there. And I can tell you in those board meetings with retired generals, army chiefs, head of intelligence, head of RNAW, a lot of security guys, they would always say that there are multiple fault lines in India. There are linguistic fault lines, religious fault lines, economic fault lines, and keeping the nation together remains a challenge for the Indian state. And therefore, secularism should not be viewed purely as an ideology, but as a necessary condition of the survival of the Indian state.
Absolutely.
I don't have time to explain that statement. But the second point I would make is you refer to the Sachar committee. What is often not realized is that a large number of the poor in India live in the two states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. Basically, between Delhi and Kolkata, you have the highest incidence of poverty. And if you look at the record of development of the last 25, 30 years, it's peninsular India that has done very well. States Maharashtra, Gujarat, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, etc. have done relatively well, and a lot of people from the north are going south today. And a large number of the poor in UP and Bihar come from the Muslim community. So there is a problem of poverty and lack of access to education. So the Sachar committee drew the attention of the government that you have to do something to educate and empower the poor. And the BJP constantly refers to one sentence in a speech that Manmohan Singh gave at the National Development Council and says, so he said that Muslims should get first preference. That was not the sentence. The sentence said scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, women and the minorities should get a preference in the allocation of resources. That was a full sentence. And I think the minorities there come in because of this data that the largest number of the poor in this country come from these two states, and most of them are from the minorities.
I'm glad to know that the issue is recognized in terms of policy making, and Dr. Manmohan Singh's full sentence is something we should all remember. And I have multiple other questions for my two guests, but I think we should perhaps open up to the floor in a bit. But coming to the next series of questions that I have for them, I'm going to go back to Dr. Baru and ask you about, you mentioned your book, India's Power Elite. And I think, and I was telling Dr. Bose about it actually, that it was so interesting that the kind of people who are not the politicians perhaps, but the bureaucrats, the people who are actually, sort of who are dotting the I's and marking out the T's, the P's and Q's in our policies are the power elite who are, probably touching lives across the country, sitting out there in Delhi. Their quality, Dr. Baru says, has changed in this particular book, and it was fascinating to hear him talk about it. And if you would tell us, what is the big difference that you are seeing from pre-2014 and post-2014, and why is it significant?
It's not pre-2014, it's really comparing the last 20, 30 years to the first 20, 30 years. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, the civil services were the preferred profession of the best and the brightest. You came from the best schools, the best colleges, and you went into the civil services, right? Because there were few other options for the talented. But as we enter the 80s and 90s with the rise of the private sector, financial sector, medical profession, other professions rising, the best and the brightest increasingly go into these other professions. And the civil services have not been attracting the same quality of talent. And there is now enough data on that if you look at the quality. And I think that has impacted with a lag. These are all chaps who got into the civil services in the 90s or early 2000s, who are now at important positions. And you see a decline in quality. It's a fact that the quality of our, whether it's the diplomacy or the police or even the armed forces leadership, no longer as good as it was 30 years back, 40 years back. Because first of all your best are going into the private sector, but the best of the best are going abroad. I have a whole chapter on the secession of the successful, where I document, the rise and just this morning, if you look at this morning's Telegraph, you have a chart on the number of Indians who opted for foreign citizenship, going up sharply.
That's
So
right.
they're all leaving.
I don't know if you agree with this view, but I, while he was speaking, also felt, maybe it's not such a bad thing. It's the rise of the subaltern, where we being too, the elite has to go out of power. What do you feel about this? Do you agree with him that it's a lack of quality that is marking our power elite today?
Social mobility is a good thing. It's something that Netaji, for example, would have very much welcomed, because he knew how unequal our society is. And I think the problem arises when social mobility becomes harnessed to certain kinds of politics of a toxic nature.
Caste.
Well, not just caste. That is a more complicated subject. But I'm speaking actually more of the dominant form of politics today, which is a very toxic form of politics. Social mobility in itself is a great thing. It's exactly what's needed.
True.
But we have a situation where a very toxic form of politics has appropriated the rhetoric of equality in a twisted way, and also the rhetoric of social justice, and is articulating the aspirations of the non-elite classes of society. Now, maybe this is all a huge con. It probably is, but it has been working and repeatedly since 2014. Maybe it will work again next year in 2024. So, I mean, to sum up, social mobility is wonderful, but its marriage with toxic politics is not.
Toxic politics and willy-nilly, Dr. Baru, your book, in a way played into it in terms of a book and then a film. And of course, I'm referring to the accidental Prime Minister. I can't let you go without talking about it. What did you feel once the book hit the bookstores and painted you into a certain position? And then again, just before 2019 parliamentary elections, you had the film out, which was not flattering to Dr. Manmohan Singh at all. Did you find yourself
Did you
in
read
a
the book?
spot?
Did you read the book?
No, I haven't.
You haven't read.
I know what you're going to say. 80%.
Because you have to read the book. I mean, there's no point in talking about it if you don't read it, because it is flattering. It is. I met him before the book came out and told him a famous principle of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was once asked, "Who is a good communist?" And his reply was, "Anyone with 70% good is good, because nobody is 100% good." And I thought that was a very liberal definition of a good person, that we expect 100% good qualities in a person. Mao was willing to live with 70% and said everybody has some bad qualities, so 30%. So I met Dr. Singh and told him, I'm writing this book, it is 70% positive and 30% negative, and that is a Mao principle, which is overall good. And he just smiled and left it at that. So he didn't even ask, what are the 30% you're writing about? So the book came out, and I think that's a fact. Now, the stupidity of the way in which the politics worked at that time was that one interpretation of the 30% became popular. Now, I can go into how it happened, why it happened, who was responsible, but the 30% was converted into 90%.
Oh gosh.
While the 70% is often not recognized. That's why whenever I am asked this question, my first response
Have
is
you
say,
read it?
have you read the book? Because
Well.
those who have read the book, and the best reviews of my book have been
True.
written
True.
by two gentlemen for whom I have the highest regard. One is Gurcharan Das, a very famous writer who wrote an excellent review in the Outlook magazine, You can Google and read that. And the second by B.G. Varghese, the late B.G. Varghese, the editor of Hindustan Times and Indian Express and Times of India, who wrote a review in the Tribune newspaper. You know, gentlemen of both of whom were great admirers of Manmohan Singh, who thought actually this is the best that could be said of him. And I still hold today that I don't think you can have a more powerful defense of his 10 years with all its faults. And the faults are there. I mean, they lost the election, you know. So it's not as if there were no faults. And to say that, you know, 30% is negative doesn't deny the 70%.
Absolutely not. But I will do a little poll here before we start winding up. And that is, how many of you have seen Accidental Prime Minister, the film? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Anyone? 5, 6. Not bad. It's really gotten around, Dr. Baru. In which case, I must ask you one last question on this issue, and that
we
is...
just have 5 minutes left, Monideepa ma'am.
And that is, if you were to write a book on the current Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, and I love your Accidental Prime Minister, you know, title for the book that you've already written, what would you call a book on Prime Minister Modi, written from the proximity that you enjoyed with Dr. Manmohan Singh?
Well, first of all, I had nothing to do with the film. I wrote the book and sold the rights, and so I had nothing to do with the film. I take full responsibility for the book. I do not take any responsibility for the film. And I think that's what most authors have always said. As for this Prime Minister, we'll need time to evaluate him. I evaluated Manmohan Singh 5 years after I left him.
Okay.
I left him in 2008. I was there only in the first term. And I wrote my book in 2013. You need a little time.
Okay.
This man is still there. And, you know,
We'll give you
let's
time.
take a final assessment of his 10 years before one can decide whether the title should be reversed. That was called the Accidental Prime Minister. Maybe in this case we say Prime Minister the Accident.
Okay, we'll wait for that book, Dr. Baru. Both titles terrific, but I cannot end this session without asking one question I've been dying to ask Dr. Sumantra Bose here, and I'm sure we'll get an unprejudiced view. Is Netaji the best Prime Minister India never had?
Let's leave Netaji in peace as the fearless and legendary anti-colonial fighter he was, and for which he is venerated by the Indian people. I do consider it a pity that he did not get to participate in the reconstruction and development of India after independence, precisely because he was such a visionary leader with very clear-cut, concrete ideas, whether it's on women's emancipation, whether it's on the form economic reconstruction should take on scientific lines, or on the absolute separation of religion and politics, which he was insistent on and practiced as a revolutionary leader, especially in the Azad Hind movement, the climactic movement of 1943 to 1945. He was absolutely insistent that national identity must transcend all religious identities. It must not be based on or derived from any religious identity. That was anathema to him, completely unacceptable. But he also had a very robust view of what constituted quote-unquote secularism, although he did not use that word as such, that Indian nationalism should not be grounded in a creed of interfaith solidarity or in a narrative of religious syncretism, Sarva Dharma Sambhava, or, Sufi Bhakti stuff. The national identity should be above all religious identities. And in the time that we live in, I think that is a very precious legacy that we need to highlight and, if possible, resurrect. Because otherwise, there could be dark times, even darker than the one now, ahead for the Indian nation.
Perhaps we can take some comfort from the fact that Netaji is somebody everybody wants to emulate today across all political lines. And with that, thank you, gentlemen. That was the most amazing discussion I have had on a subject that was never given to me except the idea of India. And I hope you leave this hall today after listening to these gentlemen with the firm belief that the idea of India is in good hands, safe hands, but something that we must all work together to keep alive and kicking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monideepa, for
Thank you.
conducting a wonderful session, as you always do. Thank you, Professor Bose. Thank you, Dr. Baru. Of course, two important publications to note. One is Dr. Sanjaya Baru's Indian Economy After COVID, very, very important publication. And the other one is Dr. Sumantra Bose's translation of Krishna Dee's writings of Krishna Dee on Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. Both books available in the book fair. Very, very important books.
This is the book that Sujata has kindly referred to. You know, most of you know of my mother, Krishna Bose, and this is a compilation of her best writings on Netaji, his life, politics, and struggle. And as she said, it's available in the book fair, published 6 months ago to coincide with the 75th anniversary of independence.
A small token of our appreciation for our panelists.